Thank you, everyone, for joining us for A Year After October 7th, a live webinar featuring David Horovitz. We have co-moderators, facilitators, Eli Rekis and Hussein Ibish. I will let them introduce themselves shortly. I wanted to thank you all for being here. As people continue coming in, I wanted to let you all know this will be recorded and posted later on, as well as we have disabled Q&A for this webinar given the topic and all the questions that we have in mind for the discussion. We have received many of your questions, and those have been incorporated to the discussion and questions that will be asked today. So thank you again very much for your attendance. If you do have any technical questions, please feel free to email us. I will put the email address in the chat box. Eli, if you would like to begin.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to the Year After October 7 webinar. I must confess, they're not a very original title. We're not the only ones. There were many webinars, and I appreciate the fact that you decided to join us today. Let me make a few quick introductions, and then we can start the discussion. First, I want to mention Crystal Falcaro-Hibbs, who just spoke. She's the program assistant, and she's actually the producer of this webinars and others, and we're very thankful to you, Crystal. I'm Eli Rekis. I'm the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern, head of the Israel Innovation Project. I was formerly with Tel Aviv University for many years, and I established Israel Studies here at Northwestern. Presently, I'm also the Israeli Asian at the Office of the Vice President for International Relations at Northwestern. Hussein Ibish, my co-moderator, co-facilitator, whatever you want to call it, is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's an established weekly columnist for The National, former columnist for Bloomberg, regular contributor to the Atlantic, Daily Beast, and a frequent contributor to many other US and Middle East outlets. He wrote two books, one, What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda, title that might be relevant for today, and Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. Our main speaker is David Horovitz. Welcome, David. It's not the first time we entertain you here, and we are honored to have you. David is a British-born Israeli journalist, leading publicist, author, and speaker. He is the founding editor of the widely circulated Times of Israel, a current affairs website based in Jerusalem that was launched in 2012 and has millions and millions of followers. David is the author of Still Life with Bombers, another book, A Little Too Close to God, and co-authored Shalom Chaver, Shalom Friend, The Life and Legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. He previously edited the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. So without further ado, I will start. And as I said, I will alternate with Hussein. I will focus mostly on the Israeli domestic scene, Israeli/Jewish domestic scene, and Hussein will center more on the Arab, Palestinian, Islamic circles. So my first question to you, David, relates to the failure. How not? A year after the catastrophe, the inevitable question that keeps occurring is what happened? How could this happen? First, from the intelligence and military point of view, but not only that, conceptually as well. Has there been a concept, a mental model, as someone called it, that betrayed us? Is it Netanyahu, his suspicion, his skepticism about our Arab neighbor, his what one writer called decisional paralysis or lazy procrastination, quote unquote, the suitcases of Qatari cash? Was there an ideological component in this failure? That of the right-wing religious settlement Zionism? Well, all of these and more I relate to you, David.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Eli, and thank you, Hussein. And I'll do my best to answer the questions as effectively as I can. And that's a very important place to start. And the fact is that we're more than a year after that catastrophe, and you're asking the question because ultimately it's unfathomable and unconscionable what happened. And you've got, you listed a number of potential and possible explanations. There's some truth to most of them, and I'll try and deal with many of them specifically, but ultimately there's no adequate explanation because from a military point of view, you, me, anybody else without particular expertise, if we had received the information that was available to Israel's military chiefs and the political echelons in the days, weeks, months, possibly even in the last few hours, we would have done a better job of preventing the Hamas invasion and slaughter, because you had to sort of be willfully ignorant or blinkered to ignore the material. And I know that many people on this call will have read and know there was, a great deal of information indicating that Hamas was gearing up to invade Israel and kill as many people as it could. There was a fence along the border that was not a physical defense. It was a fence whose strengths were in the sensors and the electronics and the cameras. The fence was no barrier unless there were, it was an early warning system, if you like, and then there were meant to be troops deployed to make sure that if anything was about to unfold, it could be rebuffed. You've heard about the surveillance soldiers who warned for days, weeks, and months. You've heard about the material that reached Israeli intelligence about Hamas's planning. There was stuff that Hamas's leadership, most especially Yahya Sinwar, spoke about openly. There was a plan, and the plan was in the hands of Israeli intelligence. So then you come to, well, if this was all so obvious, and if any of us would have done a better job at thwarting it, why didn't the people whose real job it is? And again, I guess one part of it is a sort of the best phrase that I can use, and it's not ideal. It's some kind of failure of imagination, certainly a failure of conception and assessment. But before I get to that, a failure of imagination, and I say this because I've heard this from soldiers who fought that day and who were, and I'm sure still are, consumed by guilt when they have nothing to be guilty about, that they failed at the last moment to prevent and better stave off the invasion when they were facing unwinnable odds in those first few hours, even day or two. But I've heard it all the way up the hierarchy, including the most senior people in the military, who say things like, we never believed, we didn't dream that this was going to happen. And I tell you that, and you think, well, that can't be true, because how can they not have dreamed it? Hamas, carried out strategic onslaught of suicide bombings in the Second Intifada, and very soon after October the 7th, I saw, not the only person, the wall charts in generals' offices showing the 24 Hamas battalions and knowing who their commanders were. Israel knew there was a Hamas army. The Hamas army didn't even invade. Only something in excess of maybe 3,000 terrorists invaded. So why would you not believe that this was possible? And yet they didn't. And if you want, I don't want you to think that the higher echelons of the Israeli army, or even the not most elite echelons, are utterly disconnected from the reality on the ground. Israel's a tiny country, but it's not as though they were even in sort of the military equivalent of ivory towers, which is the two skyscrapers of the Kiryat IDF and Defense Ministry headquarters in Tel Aviv. People whose whole lives in the military were devoted to protecting that particular border. The deputy general in charge of that front lives, as far as I know, on Kibbutz Be'eri. His mother was killed that morning. the #2 general in charge of the Southern Command was a prisoner of this failure of imagination, misassessment, absurd conception. And therefore, it truly is inexplicable. So, partial explanations. In the military, a kind of determined insistence on believing an intelligence assessment that Hamas was not interested in a major escalation, was not interested in invading Israel, was interested in retaining power. Even as I say it to you, more than a year later, it seems absurd. But that was the conception that they were imprisoned by. So what do you make of the fact that they had all this information? So a little partial explanation: Israel's army is still very macho, and most of the soldiers who were in the surveillance jobs watching the border, in fact, almost all of the surveillance soldiers are women, so they didn't believe them because they were just a bunch of young women. And one of the more higher-ranking intelligence officers who warned quite coherently and agitatedly was a woman. Those are kind of little partial explanations. They're not.
What about the political ideological element?
Right. So much for the military. Failure of imagination, imprisoned by a concept. The devil's advocate unit in the army, whose whole job is to assert the opposite to the prevailing assessment, marginalized and unheeded. Politically, I mean, there are a couple of things there that I don't think I would say were central. You asked about Netanyahu and his reputation for being hesitant and procrastinating. I don't think that is a central issue here. I think Netanyahu did not, well, he too was a prisoner of the conception, shall we say? And somewhere in the mix, remember, this is a far-right and right-wing government. Within that government, you have a finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who said that Hamas was an asset and the Palestinian Authority a burden in terms of the way Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is perceived, because Hamas, everyone can see that Hamas are terrible people who kill innocent people who have no interest in coexistence. So they're actually quite handy for us when we're trying to head off the more, in his view, ostensibly moderate, but actually no different Palestinian Authority. So that was in the mix as well, this kind of ostensible use that Hamas served. And then in terms of the facts, Netanyahu allowed Qatar to distribute a great deal of money into Gaza and helped sustain Hamas's rule. Whether or not that Qatari money went directly to Hamas is not really the point. Everything is fungible. More money was going into the Strip, and that was enabling Hamas to spend more and more money on every potential means of arming and building up its capacity to harm Israel. So in terms of the Netanyahu culpability, of course, he was the person who, for almost the entire period that Hamas has run Gaza, was in the most potentially capable position of understanding what was going on, of having diplomatic, political, military intelligence materials. The failure is everywhere, both the military and the political echelons. I think you have to say that the most important function of the military of any country, essentially, is to keep your civilians, your citizens safe. And therefore, ultimately, this was a colossal failure of the military, for which the politicians, they are overall responsible as well. But I don't, that was a very long way of failing to answer your question, because there's no good answer.
Before I hand the mic to Hussein, one quick additional question to that. Has the lesson been learned?
Well, I would be, so reluctant to make any assessments going ahead. We are, as we'll discuss, I'm sure, more in the coming time. We are no longer at war on a single front, as we were on October the 7th. Very quickly, we were at war on two fronts, with Hezbollah piling in on October the 8th. There was an assessment very soon after that happened that ultimately Hezbollah is different from Hamas, because Hamas really has no interest in the well-being of Gazans, but Hezbollah is much more integral to Lebanon, has a genuine political interest in the well-being of Lebanon, does not want to see Beirut reduced to what became in the first few months of Gaza City and so on. I'd just be wary of all assessments. So in terms of, has Israel learned its lesson? We were attacked 3 weeks ago with 200 ballistic missiles fired from Iran. I hope it comes through in the next few minutes that I don't believe myself to be an extremist, and I believe myself to be somewhere in the middle ground of Israeli politics. The orchestrating key threat to Israel, it seems to me, is not Iran, but the regime in Iran. It's a regime that is seeking nuclear weapons very patiently. I don't think we know how close they are to weaponization. I think we know where they are in terms of enrichment, but I suspect there's things we don't know. I don't want us to be in a situation where not many months or years from now, we say to ourselves, wow, even after October the 7th, Israel didn't realize that its key strategic goal was expediting the demise of that regime in Iran, because the consequences of that regime remaining in power are catastrophic for Israel. So I don't know that all the lessons have been learned.
Hussein,
Yeah,
your
no,
floor is yours.
thank you, Eli. David, thank you for joining us today. It's been a while since we've spoken, but I do recall you very well as a very intelligent analyst. So I'm glad to be able to ask you. Eli, proceeding from a kind of Jewish-Israeli perspective, asked a really important question about the national security state structures in Israel and the intelligence and military failures of October 7th, 8th, even 9th, that arise from that set of facts, obviously, and will have to be investigated, inside Israel. And your answer teased apart a lot of the ways in which the Israeli security establishment was surprised on October 7th and was taken aback. I'd like to pull back and sort of ask you from more looking at it from an Arab perspective. What about the Israeli public? The Israeli public appears to be traumatized, as any national community would be from such an attack, but also shocked by it. And sort of from looking at Israel from the region, but from the outside, one wonders, what do Jewish Israelis expect? I mean, in other words, people like me, we're kind of warning, and I have no clairvoyance. I mean, lots of us were saying for 15 years, 20 years before October 7th, there's going to be an explosion of violence out of the occupied territories. Where and when and by whom, we couldn't predict. But that this relationship is so toxic and so shot through with violence. So the relationship, the one is essentially in the occupation, is so toxic that if there isn't a horizon for ending it, if there is no framework for Palestinians to get out of this situation of total unfreedom, they're going to lash out in the way in which colonized people did between, say, 1857 in India and Algeria in 1961, which was probably the last time we've seen anything like this. Anyway, my question to you is what about the Israeli public? Do they really expect that something like this was never going to happen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and where you took it is not necessarily where I thought you were going to take it. And I'll try and explain. Were they shocked, and are we traumatized by October the 7th? I would say deeply in both cases. Shocked as in, and this is where I'm going to answer your question where you did take it, I think. I don't think the general, and I hope I'm accurate, I'm not interested in missteering you. I don't think the general Israeli response to October the 7th is, wow, that was the inevitable explosion of violence from the repressed, non-independent Palestinian nation. I think the shock and the trauma was, wow, why on earth was our military so incredibly incompetent and our politicians so incompetent in recognizing that a terrorist army government that had violently come to power in Gaza and strategically try to murder Israelis at every opportunity, why was it not recognized that that's what they would continue to try to do? And then to take it to where you went with, you know, don't people think this was inevitable when you've been denying the Palestinians independence? Again, in terms of answering your question, I think most Israelis, I mean, remember the center left in Israel, never mind the left, is radically reduced and discredited. I think the takeaway that the middle ground draws, and that's a middle ground that's shifted to the right, is, oh my goodness, we left Lebanon in 2000 and Hezbollah took over and it's been hell ever since. And now they're firing rockets every day at Tel Aviv. We moved back to the border there and it was a disaster. Oh, we pulled out of Gaza in 2005, Hamas took over, and look at the unprecedented catastrophe that has happened from there. And therefore, are you crazy? Now we're going to partner the quote unquote moderate Palestinians whose leadership 3 days ago or 4 days ago described Sinwar as a great leader. Now we're going to partner them towards independence in which we will make territorial concessions. So when you have an increasingly hardline prime minister like Netanyahu, who did used to speak about, or occasionally spoke about, potentially partnering the Palestinians towards statehood, when you have him now saying, he's not saying this, so I'll say it for him, I know that there are all these opportunities ostensibly for partnerships in the region, and all I have to really do is give some kind of semi-credible horizon to Palestinian statehood, including maybe some kind of Palestinian Authority role in Gaza. I'm not going to do it. I'm not letting those people have a role in Gaza. That is not a sentiment that alienates a huge proportion of Israelis. That's a sentiment.
No,
right.
I know. So, okay. Well, I mean, I guess you answered my question to a very large extent, so I'll leave it at that. The quick follow-up I had has to do with the war in Gaza. Now, I want to go from the widest aperture to a fairly narrow one. It seems to me that following the death of Sinwar and really following the end of the battle in Rafah to destroy the last remaining organized Hamas battalions, what you've ended up with is an insurgency, right, which is very different than the operations of Hamas as a well-organized, vertically integrated structure that relies on command and control, relies on leaders like Sinwar, now gone, but an insurgency that's as sort of bifurcated, or not, that's the wrong word, variegated, as the one that Hamas is pursuing now, strikes me as the war they wanted to fight. And it seems to me that their horizon is a very long one. And so I'm wondering if the Israeli military appears to you to be taken aback by the fact that they are now facing an open-ended counterinsurgency, and there's no apparent way to end it, that's what happens in counterinsurgencies. So if you could address all of that, and then Eli will take it up again, I think.
So again, these are questions that go to the root of the complexity of the current situation, for sure. I would agree with you that, and I'm not a military expert. We are told by military chiefs and by political leaders that Hamas is basically dismantled, as you said, as a sort of organized army, and that culminated in Rafah with the last of the battalions destroyed. And at the same time, as you rightly say, there are, I don't know, possibly several tens of thousands of Hamas gunmen still available. And they're not fighting in an organized fashion, but they're still capable of killing Israeli soldiers, firing an occasional rocket, and potentially waiting for the opportunity to revive. And they still, I mean, there's a major Israeli army operation going on now in northern Gaza. And the reality that we see is the assertion every now and again, including this week, that the army is now in control of northern Gaza. And you say to yourself, we saw that headline 8 months ago or 7 months ago and so on. So that's a reality that you're rightly tapping into. I don't think the army is surprised by that. In other words, I think the assumption was you'll dismantle them as an organized military group. They'll still try to fight. One of the reasons why military and intelligence officials said for some months now, this is an opportunity now. Hamas is sufficiently degraded to try and push for a hostage deal. We're going to be fighting for Hamas for a long time. We can afford a relatively short break, maybe 6 weeks, during which maybe 30 living hostages would come out. We will be able to return. It's inevitable that there will be reasons why we will need to return. People like Benny Gantz talking about we will be fighting Hamas for years. The defense minister, Yoav Gallant, saying the same thing. Prioritize the hostages now. So I don't think it's a shock, and I don't think there's any delusion that Hamas is finished. And it's certainly not finished as an ideology. I wouldn't like to speculate about the balance of support in Gaza for Hamas. I don't imagine anyone loves Israel more than they did a year ago, however much they might blame Hamas for ruination that has come to Gaza. And then you're into what the rest of your question begs is, so how does Israel solve this? And that takes us back to your previous question. Right? If you've got potentially, I don't know, forces from Egypt or the UAE or partnerships with the Saudis, which have tremendous beneficial implications for Israel, also as regards Iran, if you've got that potential, but you're not allowing any kind of role for the, again, quote unquote, relatively moderate Palestinian Authority and so on, you have this dilemma. I don't know that the political leadership has solved that dilemma, and I don't think the army thinks it's its job, although it may have all kinds of recommendations. The army, privately, I suppose, are saying things like, we need to prepare for the day after, otherwise we're going to have to keep on doing this. And I imagine the Prime Minister and some of his coalition allies say, that's all well and good. We need to create a situation where it's safe for some kind of alternative leadership to come in there, but we're not going to do it with the Palestinian Authority. And therefore, it seems right now, other players, including the Egyptians, are not going to come in either. And you've got Tony Blinken, who's in Israel right now. And I'm sure that variations of this question are on the table. He will, I assume, be saying to Netanyahu, has probably said it already today, so what's the plan here? What's the strategy? If you're opposed to our notion of some kind of even reformed Palestinian Authority or some kind of civil Palestinian something, if you're opposed to that and everybody else is saying, well, we won't help you out if you don't do that, how are you going to solve this? And Netanyahu is saying, well, let's be realistic. Nobody else is actually going to come in anyway who we can depend upon, because Hamas is still potent to some degree. You know, all I'm doing in trying to answer your astute question is highlighting that, again, similar to Ellie's opening question, I'm sorry to say, you know, how did this happen? Can't tell you. How is Israel going to get to the day after, given the policies of the government and the concerns about the PA? I don't know the answer to that either.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Hussein. I do want to move to the domestic scene in Israel, but one thought that keeps haunting me is, following your last comment, David, is what do you tell the younger generation in Israel? What about the day after? Where is the horizon? Where is the political horizon for us? Again, I don't want to overestimate the calls of younger people talking about relocating and so forth and so forth. I think it's widely exaggerated, but still, the question that is hanging in the air, if I may say so, is tell us, we want to know. Don't tell us what not. Tell us what yes. Where do we go? So this was an introduction. Now I'm coming to my question.
Oh, that wasn't even the question?
I'm sorry. Okay, I'll stop here. I'll let you deal with it.
Let me try and then follow up.
No. This is a crucial question.
Yeah. So I actually want to go a little before you get to that question. The reality, of course, is of a nation that is spectacularly resilient amid the trauma. I don't know of other countries. I don't know how other countries would cope with the reality that we're grappling with, including, I mean, things that are just insane and surreal. You know, you have hours of warnings that Iran is about to fire drones at you, and you should, you know, stay somewhere near your bomb shelter in the initial hours of those warnings. That was in April. On October the 1st, it was in the afternoon, the nation was suddenly told, yes, stay within 90 seconds of your safe room or your bomb shelter because their ballistic missiles are on their way. Like to sort of be told ahead of time that death machines are heading towards you and have experts assessing how likely they are to kill you. And add to that, we're in a situation now where it's barely reported, right? But there are hundreds of missiles fired quite deep into Israel most days of the week, certainly including today, right? And add to that, Ellie, and it's relevant for the question that you started to ask there. We're a fairly small country with a fairly small army that is largely dependent on reservists, right? People who are not in the standing army. And many of them have done something like 200 days of reserve duty since October the 7th, 2023. In other words, they've spent most of their time for the past year plus in the army, and they're not in the army. They're people with families and jobs, and they're exhausted, and their businesses are in trouble, and the country is so relatively alone that investment in their businesses in many cases is drying up. The economy is very battered, right? So before we get to what do you say to the young people about the future, the present is really complicated, and yet the nation is pretty resilient. And one of the things that I think, and this is my anecdotal assessment, in that mix is, first of all, not everybody in Israel has an opportunity to relocate. And many people in Israel, I think the mainstream sentiment is we better make this country survive and get it back to thriving again, because the future is not good for the Jewish people worldwide without an Israel. We better make sure that we can continue to make a go of this country, and we better hang together. And, you know, one of the issues that I'm very concerned about, and I get a lot of abuse for highlighting from ostensible Zionists, is you can't really do that with a divisive leadership. You have to have a leadership that is genuinely able to unify, and our leadership is not strong on that, and I'm being a little polite here. But I don't think it's a question of what you tell the young people. I think it's the decisions and the mindset that younger Israelis have. And like I say, pretty resilient, pretty determined to keep this country together and make sure it thrives in an incredibly difficult reality. And I say that as a father of children in their late 20s and early 30s, not taking this out of midair. I'll add to that, and I'm being really candid with you. We have a changing Jewish populace here. That the nation has moved to the political right, and it is, I think, increasingly Orthodox. The fastest growing sector of the population is the ultra-Orthodox. It's a huge issue, including most relevantly and practically as relates to the military. You've got a whole sector of the populace that doesn't do military or national service. That is a great divisive and weakening issue as well. But the optimism that I have about Israel stems from the younger people, from the younger generation, who I think want to make sure this country survives, and who are battling not only external enemies, but internal divides and inequalities.
Hussein, can I quick follow up on that
Yeah.
with your permission, and then I'll let you have more time. You mentioned Zionism in passing. Now, at the core of the post-1948 Zionism stood the notion that after the Holocaust, Israel serves as the haven for Jews anywhere. There is a refuge. You can law of return and so forth. I want to quote Yossi Klein Halevi, who wrote in your newspaper that the present period represents, I quote, the end of the post-Holocaust era. And what he meant by that is that looking around US campuses, for example, including our own at Northwestern, how is it that Israel and the Zionist ideal at its core has become a pariah state, an outcast, subject to isolation, criticism, unreserved hatred? Has the genuine Zionist ideal gone bankrupt. I'm saying something strong, but given the anti-Zionist wave, the polarized Israeli society between, as you mentioned, the religious, the messianic religious, and the secularists, where did we go wrong, or what went wrong?
Okay, so first of all, I want to just take one step back and add something to my previous answer, which is worth bearing in mind. We spoke about the unfathomable failure where Gaza is concerned. I think Israelis are somewhat encouraged and regaining some of their confidence in their military and maybe political leadership with the nature of the battling against Hezbollah. I don't want to get carried away here. But unlike Gaza, where the war plan was drawn up, ad hoc, because there was actually no preparation for anything like October the 7th, there was very serious planning for potential conflict with Hezbollah. You saw the exploding pagers, which Israel has not claimed, but I think has made fairly clear without claiming that it had an interest in that operation. And then the decimation of the Hezbollah leadership. An effective military operation so far. I wouldn't get carried away. I think that is also bolstering a certain beginning of a growing faith in the military's capacity to keep the country safe and do better in the future. In terms of failures of Zionism, Israel was meant to be the haven. Now it's a pariah and so on. I would place much more emphasis on the misrepresentation of what has been happening here and the very rapid slide. I mean, there was almost no indulgence of the notion that Israel should have the right to defend itself after October the 7th. It did not take many days for those demonstrations that you mentioned to start breaking out on American campuses. And therefore, if I was talking about the end of the post-Holocaust era, and I would define that as the period in which people thought to themselves, my God, human beings are capable of doing terrible things to each other. We have to reach for our better selves, and the marginalizing of anti-Semitism. I would say, indeed, this period marks the end of that era. I'm not sure that it ended on October the 7th. I think maybe it had ended before that. And the return to the mainstream of anti-Semitism. If your only obsession is Israel and its perceived misdeeds, and that's what American campuses are grappling with, that's not anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Zionism. That's anti-Semitism. And therefore, I would be looking not at the terrible blame that attaches to Israel, but the failure of education and leadership and effectively explaining to people some realities and the revival of anti-Semitism. I find looking from a distance, and I haven't been to the States since October the 7th, I have been in the UK, I find it incredibly depressing and rather surprising to see how rapidly this anti-Israel, anti-Semitism spread across campuses, championed by people who are overtly anti-Semitic and who are not denounced for that. The failure of academic leadership, the incoherent indulgence from the senior officials at the most eminent universities, the misreporting in America's most resourced media outlets, who more than a year on give credulity to Hamas accounts of what is happening. Sometimes don't even attribute false allegations made by Hamas and simply state them as ostensible fact. There's some really bad failures. Now, I don't think Israel is immune from criticism. I truly don't. And I do journalism, and we do journalism, warts and all. And among my criticisms, Israel has no public diplomacy. But also, I'm very critical of the government. Our government includes people, in my opinion, who are anti-Zionists. Anyone who is seeking, for example, to maximize Israeli control all the way between the river and the sea is potentially dooming Israel either as a democracy or as a Jewish state. That is not a foundational Zionist approach. I'm pretty happy with the Declaration of Independence as a recipe for Zionism. And therefore, we have issues that we have to deal with here. But in the overall balance of blame, when I look at Israel as a pariah nation, and I think you're right that we're well on that route, it's much less about choices that Israel has made. It's about the reality that we're battling and the way anti-Semitism has surged back into the mainstream. around the world, which goes back, by the way, to my answer to your previous question, which is why most Israelis, I think, say to themselves, oh my goodness, we had better make sure that this country survives and thrives, because the Jewish people around the world, it's not looking good for them. And therefore, we better make sure that we can serve as a haven again for the Jewish people.
Hussein, floor is all yours.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question to my last one, not to what Ellie was saying, but you should come to the U.S. and you might want to meet with some of the students who've been protesting. I've been around. I've met a lot of them. There are undoubtedly anti-Semites who've been loud, but I've met a lot of protesters. I haven't met any who were really anti-Semitic, and a lot of them were Jewish. But at any rate, I have no doubt there are anti-Semites who are very loud, who get the headlines. But I think there's a lot more to it. So come to the U.S. and take a look around when you get a chance. The second, but I do want to go back to the question of Lebanon, right? So you're absolutely right. Obviously, Israel was fighting until recently, at least the war wanted to fight or prepared to fight anyway, in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And you could tell from the penetration of Hezbollah's intelligence, from the, spectacular intelligence victories like the pager explosions, things like that, the ability to pinpoint and eliminate the entire senior leadership, whether it's battlefield commanders, all the way up to Hassan Nasrallah himself and Brahim Akal and Fuad Shukr and everybody. But now Israel is battling on the ground in Lebanon, and it looks like the potential for another quagmire. But I don't want to really ask a kind of Lebanon limited question. I want to ask about Israel's overall security doctrine, because it strikes me that at the moment, with this multi-front reality that's beginning to develop all around Israel, and more violence than ever in the West Bank, especially in Jenin and Tulkarem recently, with the IDF really cracking down on the youth gangs there and, and other groups, that you're looking at a situation or a country that from the outside looks like it is relying entirely on force to achieve security, and is both as a cause and an effect in a vicious circle of this, surrounded by armed foes. And this feeds the desire, right, to create a fortress Israel and create security entirely through military might. But then there's a problem with the settlements being, sort of outside of the accepted borders. Or are they? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just assumed to be part of Israel. But overall, the basic problem is you could always push the border back in any direction. Or you can always create a new border by pushing it forward. But if there's a conflict on the other side of that border, you're still in a series of wars. So is Israel, my real question is Israel sliding into a situation where it is forced to rely on armed conflict to deal with most of its neighbors once again?
Okay, I want to just, before I get to that, I want to come back to the very small point that you made at the beginning. First of all, I love the United States, and I'm very happy to go to the United States. It does not seem to me that the anti-Semitic element is marginal. It seems to me that the protests are largely characterized by an obsessive effort to deny Israel the tools to defend itself, and its main placards are things like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That's I interpret that.
You should ask
call.
people what they mean by that. I mean,
yeah, so
your interpretation may be different.
I read it as a call to destroy Israel, and if they don't mean it to be a call to destroy Israel, they should change their banner.
So I agree with that, and I've advised them to do that, but they're addicted to that. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so in terms of the meaty question that you were asking there, at the moment, I think Israel is seeking to restore its deterrent capability and restore stability to its borders and enable its people to sleep in their homes at night. So, for example, on the Lebanese front, yeah, there were some spectacular successes, and now we're into something that is much more complicated, and it's going to start raining soon, and ground maneuvers in Lebanon, and there's an awareness of that are not going to be easy, and so on. At the same time, you've got 60,000 people who can't return to their homes in the north. It might be that there is some diplomatic opportunity in the near future. At the moment, I see a Hezbollah that is in bad shape, but still several times mightier than Hamas was when it started. And it's, it fired a drone at Netanyahu's home, and we've been finally allowed by military censorship today to report that it actually hit his home and smashed a window there, didn't get in. I don't see Hezbollah being deterred. And I think if you were asking Israel's military or political leadership at the moment, they would say our first priority at the moment is to enable people to sleep soundly within the sovereign borders of this country and deter forces from attacking us. And that's why what I said before about Iran, I think, is very, very important. I think that's the prime concern that Israel has in terms of its essential security. That means that, to give you the unfortunate answer to your question, in the short term, it is military security that is the priority. And there are other fronts that we haven't discussed yet. There's the Houthis. There were two soldiers killed on a base in the Golan Heights a few weeks ago from a drone fired from Iraq. And there are spy rings being exposed almost every day lately in Israel of people who are recruited by Iran. Israelis, Israeli Jews in some cases, Israeli citizens in many cases. We have not had an explosion of the internal front, if you like, in cities like Lod and Ramla that we did have in years past. If you're looking at the Hamas effort to stir up every potential front, there is that one has not been stirred up, but there are multiple fronts, and you're absolutely right. And in terms of the medium and long term, I, as an Israeli and people who care about this country, we don't want to have to live like that with no horizon for ourselves either, an endless military service and endless threats and so on. And my belief has always been that the only way forward in that regard is through education and through an acceptance by both sides that both peoples have narratives and histories, and they don't have to believe the others, but they need to come to terms with the fact that nobody's going anywhere and try to find a way in which people are prepared to genuinely coexist. My sense, and it's me on this call, is that the prospects of that are much reduced now because of radicalization on both sides, and they're not the same kinds of radicalization, but on the Israeli side, an already ebbing faith that we could come to terms in the near future with our immediate neighbors reduced even more so. I mean, things like the PLO eulogizing Yahya Sinwar are not going to encourage Israelis to think that they can afford to risk letting their guard down again. And that's what happened. Israel let its guard down, and therefore the prospects and the confidence in some kind of moderate way forward is so much reduced. I don't think that the long-term future for Israel needs to be, and certainly I hope it does not need to be, endlessly living by the sword. I think it will require never letting your guard down, but then you have to strive to create the circumstances for potential coexistence. I just think we're further away from that now than at any time that I've lived in Israel, which is 40 years plus, and certainly includes the period of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. This is the most dismal period, including for the issues that you asked about in your question.
Thank you, David. I'm looking at the watch. Our time is narrowing down. One thought that went through my mind is that in a future webinar that we might be organizing, I would very much like to have as the main speaker a Palestinian spokesperson, either a journalist or man of government, to be able to address many of the questions that you raised, David, to him or her. I think it would be useful. But going back to the domestic scene, I began with failure, and I seem to be ending with failure. The other aspect of failure which I want to bring up is the failure of the Israeli mainstream central left political body to, I would say, even its impotence to reverse the political scene in Israel and create a change and remove the Likud religious coalition from power. And this brings me to the wider question of the state of Israeli society, which is torn. I'm Israel born, actually I'm Palestine born. And I don't recall a period where Israel was so polarized, divided, sectarian, in perhaps the worst manner that we have ever seen. One figure from a poll that was this recently conducted, 65% of the Israelis think that internal cleavage is worse than the external threat. And the schism is on several levels, Haredi versus seculars, the national religious versus seculars, and the right-wing Bibi, quote-unquote, base versus the non-Bibi base. So the country is torn. How eroded has Israeli society become in your view? And is it and how is it repairable? Not is it repairable?
So, I kind of mentioned this in a previous answer, but I'll elaborate a little bit more. I think Israeli Jewish sentiment and just its nature has changed over the decades. Our society has become a greater proportion of that society is ultra-Orthodox, and you use the word the center-left mainstream. That was indeed the mainstream from 48 to 77, and then certainly part of the mainstream. The center-left, I suppose, if that means Yesh Atid and the Democrats, I don't think Yesh Atid would take kindly to being called the center-left. I think they'd rather think of themselves as the center. Benny Gantz's party, the National Unity Party, I think would think of itself as centrist. So there's very little of the center-left, and that's in large part because of the discrediting of the notion of one being able to make peace with the Palestinians. And then I think what's worth noting is that the Likud, which was a right-wing party as opposed to a far-right party, is certainly a mix of both at the moment. There was a conference yesterday near the Gaza border at which several Likud Knesset members spoke, and at least one minister, maybe more from Likud, about resettling Gaza. And you have a coalition now which won a majority in the last elections at the end of 2022, which includes radical far-right membership.
Can I interrupt you? Would elections be held today? You think that the map would look different? I know prophecy is given to the fools.
Yeah, but the fact that there's no definitive answer that I could give, and the way I can answer your question, I think helps answer your previous question. In other words, I wouldn't want to be prophetic, but it seems to me that that whatever coalition would take office after the next elections would likely have a right-wing component. And if I was trying to put together the safest bet of a mix of parties that could win an election, I would assume it would come from the right. That there would be, it might be Netanyahu or it might be Naftali Bennett, but I don't think it would be Yair Golan of the Democrats, and I don't think it would even be Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid. And I personally don't think that Benny Gantz would be capable of beating Netanyahu, having failed to do so, and then helped Netanyahu out on various occasions in recent years. So I think if I was trying to look realistically about a coalition that didn't include the far right, for example, I would be looking at a a different right-wing led coalition as having the most likely chance of winning re-election here. So I think that points to how the mainstream in Israel has shifted. And in terms of divided, you saw the two parties, American parties, major conventions, and you saw representatives of families of hostages welcomed with unanimous empathy and support, and not a discordant heckle from the audience in the tens of thousands. There is no event in Israel of any size at which relatives of hostages could stand up and say, we need to bring them home, in which there would not be opposition. You might think that, of course, all of Israel is behind the families of the hostages. That is not the case. And that is a little pointer at disunity. This government was focused for its first 9 months plus on legislation that would have subjugated the judiciary to the coalition majority, and took its eye off many other balls. And that you can throw that into the explanations that I failed to give you for your first question about how did this happen. One of the things that was a factor was Israel was tearing itself apart about the judicial overhaul, and that emboldened, at the very least, I think, some of its enemies. Even that hasn't gone away. You might find that unbelievable. There are people who are still trying to push that judicial overhaul thing when Israel is kind of fighting for its life on multiple fronts. Yeah, still going. Is Netanyahu capable of firing his defense minister because Yoav Gallant opposes continuing to exclude the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, from the army? Yeah, he's capable of doing that. So very divided, very bitterly divided, even as this country, like the way I see it, is certainly battling for its survival.
Thank you. I can't say
I have a quick
Hussein, you have the last.
I'll ask you a quick last question about Israel's relationship with the Arab world. Before October 7, the U.S. was working on a triangular set of arrangements that would have brought Israel a normalization with Saudi Arabia that probably opened the door for most of the rest of Sunni majority Muslim countries, certainly most Arab countries, to follow suit. Saudi Arabia is the big enchilada in so many different ways, strategically, geographically, politically, etc. In the light of the post-October 7 disasters in Israel and in Gaza and elsewhere, Saudi Arabia is looking for a clarification of what you mentioned before. You talked about in Israel's sovereign territory, to be safe, Israeli citizens to be safe in their sovereign territory. And what the Saudis are really asking for is, what is that sovereign territory? Define it for us. And, what the minimum they're asking for is an Israeli recognition of the Palestinian right to statehood, and an undertaking to get into negotiations to establish one eventually not in Jordan, but in sort of mandatory Palestine, between the river and the sea somewhere. And that's what they're looking for, but it doesn't look like there are any takers for that. The Saudis are extremely keen because they see this as the path to a mutual defense agreement with Washington. And they really, really do want to normalize with Israel, but they just can't strategically justify the cost benefit unless they get something out of the Israelis serious on the Palestinians. What do you think Israel could give? What do you think the Israeli public would bear to exchange for that kind of security?
So if you had Netanyahu on this call, he would refer you to his speech at the UN, and he would say, this is my goal, and this is the opportunity that we have here. We have the opportunity to build relationships, and we have a shared interest in facing down the axis of evil and so on. But you're asking a more specific question. So what would, first of all, you're asking what Israelis would agree to, and then you're, by extension, in a way, I have to tell you, so, what would Netanyahu agree to?
Yeah, the polity in general, what would it bear? Yeah.
Well, so, Netanyahu would, I don't think would say, I am prepared to partner the Palestinians towards statehood in the foreseeable future. If he was being, completely candid, he might say, I wouldn't rule it out in the future. There would have to be a different leadership, a leadership that is not paying terrorists and is not committed to destroying Israel. In principle, I'm sure he could find wording that if the Saudis, for example, wanted to move forward, they would be able to portray it as something that they could live with. I think the mainstream in Israel is probably a little more dovish than Netanyahu on this. But again, I come back to what I said before, utterly, very, very wary about the notion of actually relinquishing territory that is currently in Israel's control. Does that mean that Israelis really consider their sovereignty needs to extend, or essentially does extend tacitly already deep into the West Bank? I'm not sure that the most Israelis would say that. I think they would say we need to control adjacent territory because look at what has happened when we've relinquished adjacent territory. But for the future beyond the foreseeable, I think a lot of Israelis would say it would be wonderful if we could build alliances, if we can then therefore be part of a regional structure that marginalizes the people who are trying to wipe us out. And by the way, that in a process that gradually changes the mindset of some of the actual people as opposed to their leadership, some of the actual people who live on our borders. But all of that, as I think I've said, and as I'm sure you know, the likelihood of that has receded because of everything that's happened in the last 12 and a half months. Netanyahu would, I'm sure, more articulately than I have, be able to explain why in his conception, there is a way to progress with the Saudis and with others, with all his concerns and reservations and refusals as regards the Palestinians. I, who am less articulate and do not make these decisions, wonder where that formula really can run. Can you actually draw up a formula that this government would be able to advance, that would enable substantial progress with the Saudis? I don't know that that's doable, at the same time as I do think that the Prime Minister would like to be able to do it. So I don't see how he can do that. I think Israelis more dovish than him would be maybe prepared to go a little bit further, but I'm not sure very much. And therefore, unfortunately, as has been my answer to so many of your questions, it's a pretty pessimistic answer that I'm giving you there, including from an Israeli interest point of view. Of course, it's in our interest to have bolstered relations in this region and marginalize the terrible people. I don't see a way to get to that at the moment.
I do think the Saudis are keen on it, though, if possible.
Right. So, are they prepared to take something that's really, there's not that much to it, but sounds okay and is enough for them to advance?
TBD.
That's kind of the question.
Friends, our time is over, unfortunately. I'd like to thank you. Thank David. You just said that you're less articulate. I quote you. I think you're very articulate and you're very eloquent. And if and when you come to the States, you have an open invitation to visit us at Northwestern.
Thank you.
You so much. Thank you, Hussein, for adding the additional dimension that was so missing in my question and representation. I think we covered a lot of territory. There are still unanswered questions. The ultimate question, what about the day after, remains unanswered. Yeah. And we will not open it now. I don't think we know, even though we have speculated. There are a lot of question marks that remain open. And I hope that we'll be able to respond in future such webinars. I would also like to mention that we will put it on YouTube, so those who were not able to join us would be able to follow. So thank you very much again, and let's meet again soon.
I hope so.
Thank you to the both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.